2.2.1 Stakeholder Engagement and Learning Objectives. This section considers those who ultimately will be key to the project's success, stakeholders. Without the effective engagement of stakeholders, there is a risk that the project will not meet its success criteria. By the time you have studied this section, you will have completed the following Learning Outcome Assessment Criteria for Understand Project Management Planning. 4.6 Explain how a stakeholder analysis supports effective stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders are people, groups or institutions with interests in a program or project. Primary stakeholders are immediate communities of interest. Often they will be described as internal stakeholders, particularly if they are involved directly with the implementation of the project. Secondary stakeholders, usually external stakeholders, are the intermediaries in the process, and may include government agencies and other institutional bodies. Groups or individuals closest to the project may not actually think of themselves as stakeholders, because they feel they own the management processes, for example, the project manager and team. A rule of thumb for ensuring that key stakeholders have been included in the process is to question whose support or lack of it might significantly influence the success of the project. This is a particularly good test, where groups claim to speak for a wider representation than may be the case, and their capacity to articulate their concerns might easily cause other groups to be overlooked. Stakeholder analysis supporting effective stakeholder engagement. If our ultimate goal is stakeholder engagement, we first need to look at each stakeholder and their relationship to the project. Different types of relationships need different kinds of approaches. Some need more activity than others. Similarly, stakeholders can be quite specific, for example, as individuals or geographically identifiable groups of people, while others are more difficult to define, and we have to think more laterally about how we are going to establish and maintain a relationship with them. Stakeholder analysis starts with the identification of a project's key stakeholders, and assessing their interests in the project and the ways in which those interests affect project risks and viability. It contributes to project design by identifying the goals and roles of different groups, and by helping to formulate appropriate forms of engagement with these groups. Developing a sound stakeholder environment means understanding the needs of stakeholders, both perceived and in reality. A typical approach could include understanding the roles of the various stakeholders, and how this information may be used as an opportunity to improve both the perception and reception of the project. Identifying the real nature of each stakeholder group's business and their consequent interest in the project. Since understanding stakeholders' behaviors and motivations towards the project. Since assessing how stakeholders may react to various approaches and methods of communication. Since identifying the characteristics of the stakeholders' environments, and developing appropriate responses to facilitate a good relationship. Responding to the stakeholders' motivations in relation to the project. Since determining the key areas that will have the most impact on the successful reception of the project. Ultimately, project management must take into consideration all parties, whose actions may change the course of the project. The objectives of these stakeholders involved in a project are unlikely to be congruent. For example, the aim of the sponsoring organization is to minimize the cost of the project, and that of the delivery contractor is to maximize profit. Project managers should be aware of all stakeholders and their likely objectives. They will find it difficult to please all of them because the objectives are often in conflict. Political skill will be a useful attribute to assure maximum satisfaction among the stakeholders. Environmental groups are perhaps a good example of stakeholders, who often have a direct and categoric opposition to the project, regardless of how it is eventually implemented. For example, the decision on whether to build Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport, London, was held up for more than 10 years by stakeholders, influencing one of the most complex public inquiries ever mounted in Britain. Having identified the various stakeholders, each may be assigned to a category according to their relative ability to influence the project and the level of power they are thought to have. Figure 2.2.1.1 shows a typical power interest matrix used to position stakeholders accordingly. 3 distinct tasks are envisaged, namely, identification and mapping of relevant stakeholders, sense analysis of their interests in and relative power over the project or program, Since development of an outline action plan defining how each stakeholder group will be managed throughout the life cycle of the project and the likelihood of them supporting the project. Figure 2.2.1.1 An approach to capturing analysis of stakeholders' power is a factor that is related to influence. Each stakeholder is analyzed as null to their degree of importance according to their level of power and therefore their ability to influence the project. Appropriate members of the project team can then prioritize their efforts accordingly to maintain the necessary stakeholder engagement, thus giving rise to the best chances of ultimate project success. If the project is large enough, or the stakeholder linkages are sufficiently intense, the project team's stakeholder engagement efforts may be assigned to a specific group within the project team. Assignments of this kind would be fully recorded in the project's communication plan. This plan will assign specific responsibilities to those who will conduct communication, and describe the overall engagement strategy of how information about the project will be conveyed to those who need that information, who could be external stakeholders, such as the general public, for example. Carrying out such an in-depth analysis of stakeholders will consume resources, and so to justify this consumption the project manager must acknowledge the importance of managing stakeholder expectations, and how they will influence the overall success of the project, particularly in the areas described below. Improved communications planning. Not everybody needs to know everything, but everybody needs to know something. The results of the analysis will define the key communication requirements. These requirements are essential to assure effective engagement. This is especially true if the key interests of the stakeholders have been gathered in terms of time, cost, quality, scope and benefits. Not only can the appropriate level of information be ascertained, but also where the information will come from and how it will be transmitted. Ensuring a productive team is formed knowing which is the most appropriate engagement strategy to adopt for stakeholders. Either partnering, being consultative or needing to be involved or simply kept informed, will help to define whether or not they need a place on the team. The outputs of the analysis should indicate which stakeholder relationships might be most productive for the project being considered. Those seen as partners may play a key role as suppliers and members of the steering group, depending on their interests and level of seniority. Engagement strategies for stakeholders in other areas may ultimately encourage them to be partners too. Similarly, if there are many stakeholder groups that need to be consulted, this may mean that a team needs to be formed to complete these activities. Enabling effective engagement actions to be initiated once identified, it is possible to apply a further analysis to the stakeholders to develop an engagement strategy for dealing with them. Effective engagement requires the project team to focus on understanding stakeholder perspectives and to address these in order to achieve the intended outcomes. Putting an effort to explore stakeholder points of view has the dual benefit of building understanding of the issues and building relationships. Increase likelihood of project being accepted. Know there are stakeholders who are important, particularly when the project reaches the handover, as they will decide whether the output should be accepted or not. Identifying these stakeholders from the outset and fulfilling their needs will be a big step in ensuring stakeholder satisfaction is sufficient to warrant the product being accepted into the operational environment.